Welcome to the Folktale Project. This is Dan Scholes. Today we're going to pick up where we left off with the French story of Blondine. And for those of you who have not started it, I would stop the podcast right now, go back, and listen to Blondine Part 1. There you'll get some background on the little princess, her little sister, her father the king, and her mother. Well, stepmother, Forbette. For those of you who do remember, let's get started. This is Blondine Lost. Blondine grew to be 7 years old and Brunette 3. The king had given Blondine a charming little carriage drawn by ostriches, and a little coachman 10 years of age, who was the nephew of her nurse. This little page, who was called Gourmandinette, loved Blondine tenderly. He had been a playmate from her birth, and she had shown him 1,000 acts of kindness. But Gourmandinette had one terrible fault. He was a gourmand, was so fond of dainties and sweet things that for a paper of bonbons he would commit almost any wicked action. Blondine often said to him, "I love you dearly, Gourmandinette, but I do not love to see you so greedy. I entreat you to correct this villainous fault, which will make you despised by all the world." Gourmandinette kissed her hand and promised to reform. But alas, he continued to steal cakes from the kitchen and bonbons from the storeroom. Often, indeed, he was whipped for his disobedience and gluttony. The queen, Forbette, heard on every hand the reproaches lavished upon the page, and she was cunning enough to think that she might make use of this weakness of Gourmandinette, and thus get rid of poor Blondine. The garden, in which Blondine drove her little carriage, drawn by ostriches and guided by her little coachman Gourmandinette, was separated by a grating from an immense and magnificent forest, called the Forest of Lilacs, because during the whole year these lilacs were always covered with superb flowers. No one, however, entered these woods. It was well known that it was enchanted ground, and that if you entered there, you would never hope to escape. Gourmandinette knew the terrible secret of this forest. He had been severely forbidden ever to drive the carriage of Blondine in that direction, lest by some chance Blondine might pass the grating and place her little feet on the enchanted ground. Many times the king, Benin, had sought to build a wall the entire length of the grating, or to secure it in some way as to make the entrance there impossible. But the workmen had no sooner laid the foundation than some unknown and invisible power raised the stones, and they disappeared from sight. The queen, Forbette, now sought diligently to gain the friendship of Gourmandinette by giving him every day some delicious dainties. In this way, she made him so complete a slave to his appetite that he could not live without the jellies, bonbons, and cakes which she gave him in such profusion. At last, she sent for him to come to her and said, "Gourmandinette, it depends entirely upon yourself whether you shall have a large trunk full of bonbons and delicious dainties, or never again eat one during your life." "Never eat one again? Oh, madam, I should die of such punishment. Speak, madam, what must I do to escape this terrible fate?" "It is necessary," said the queen, looking at him fixedly, "that you should drive the Princess Blondine near to the Forest of Lilacs." "I cannot do it, madam. The king has forbidden it." "Ah, you cannot do it? Well, then, adieu. No more dainties for you. I shall command everyone in the house to give you nothing. "Oh, madam," said Gourmandinette, weeping bitterly, "do not be so cruel. Give me some order which is in my power to execute." "I can only repeat that I command you to lead the Princess Blondine near to the forest of lilacs, that you encourage her to descend from the carriage to cross the grating and enter the enchanted ground." "But, madam," replied Gourmandinette, turning very pale, "if the princess enters this forest, she can never escape from it. You know the penalty of entering upon enchanted ground. To send my dear princess there is to give her up to certain death." "For the third and last time," said the queen, frowning fearfully, "I ask if you will take the princess to the forest. Choose! Either an immense box of bonbons which I will renew every month, or never again to taste the delicacies which you love." "But how shall I escape from the dreadful punishment which His Majesty would inflict upon me?" "Do not be disquieted on that account. As soon as you have induced Blondine to enter the forest of lilacs, return to me. I will send you off out of danger with your bonbons, and I charge myself with your future fortune." "Oh, madam, have pity upon me. Do not compel me to lead my dear princess to destruction. She who has always been so good to me." "You still hesitate? Miserable coward! Of what importance is the fate of Blondine to you? When you have obeyed my commands, I will see that you enter the service of Brunetta, and I declare to you solemnly that the bonbons shall never fail." Gourmandinette hesitated, and reflected a few moments longer, and, alas, at last resolved to sacrifice his good little mistress to his gluttony. The remainder of the day he still hesitated, and he lay awake all night weeping bitter tears as he endeavored to discover some way to escape from the power of the wicked queen. But the certainty of the queen's bitter revenge if he refused to execute her cruel orders, and the hope of rescuing Blondine at some future day by seeking the aid of some powerful fairy, conquered his irresolution and decided him to obey the queen. In the morning, at 10 o'clock, Blondine ordered her little carriage and entered it for a drive, after having embraced the king her father, and promised him to return in 2 hours. The garden was immense. Gourmandinette, on starting, turned the ostriches away from the forest of lilacs. When, however, they were entirely out of sight of the palace, he changed his course, and turned towards the grating which separated them from the enchanted ground. He was sad and silent. His crime weighed upon his heart and conscience. "What is the matter?" said Blondine kindly. "You say nothing. Are you ill, Gourmandinette?" "No, my princess, I am well." "But how pale you are! Tell me what distresses you, poor boy, and I promise to do all in my power to make you happy." Blondine's kind inquiries and attentions almost softened the hard heart of Gourmandinette, but the remembrance of the bonbons promised by the wicked queen for Bette soon chased away his good resolutions. Before he had time to reply, the ostriches reached the grating of the forest of lilacs. "Oh, the beautiful lilacs!" exclaimed Blondine. "How fragrant, how delicious! I must have a bouquet of these beautiful flowers for my good papa. Get down, Gourmandinette, and bring me some of those superb branches. I cannot leave my seat, princess. The ostriches might run away with you during my absence." "Do not fear," replied Blondine. "I could guide them myself to the palace. But the king would give me a terrible scolding for having abandoned you, princess. It is best that you go yourself and gather your flowers." "That is true. I should be very sorry to get you a scolding, my poor Gourmandinette." While saying these words, she sprang lightly from the carriage, crossed the bars of the grating, and commenced to gather the flowers. At this moment, Gourmandinette shuddered and was overwhelmed with remorse. He wished to repair his fault by calling Blondine, but although she was only 10 steps from him, although he saw her perfectly, she could not hear his voice. And in a short time, she was lost to view in the enchanted forest. For a long time, Gormandagnet wept over his crime, cursed his gluttony, and despised the wicked queen Forbette. At last, he recalled to himself that the hour approached at which Blondine would be expected at the palace. He returned to the stables through the back entrance and ran at once to the queen, who was anxiously expecting him. On seeing him so deadly pale and his eyes inflamed from the tears of awful remorse, she knew that Blondine had perished. "Is it done?" said she. Gormandagnet bowed his head. He had not the strength to speak. "Come," said she, "behold your reward." She pointed to a large box full of delicious bonbons of every variety. She commanded a valet to raise the box and place it upon one of the mules which had brought her jewelry. "I confide this box to Gormandagnet, in order that he may take it to my father," she said. "Go, boy, and return in a month for another." She placed in his hand at the same time a purse full of gold. Gormandagnet mounted the mule in perfect silence and set off in full gallop. The mule was obstinate and wilful, and soon grew restive under the weight of the box and began to prance and kick. He did this so effectually that he threw Gormandagnet and his precious box of bonbons upon the ground. Gormandagnet, who had never ridden upon a horse or mule, fell heavily with his head upon the stones and died instantly. Thus, he did not receive from his crime the profit which he had hoped, for he had not even tasted of the bonbons which the queen had given him. No one regretted him. No one but the poor Blondine had ever loved him. And that is part 2 of Blondine Lost, telling the story of how Blondine comes to be lost in the forest of lilacs and the duplicitous nature of her gluttonous friend, Gormandagnet. Such an apt name, isn't it? This is Dan Schulz for the Folktale Project. Don't forget that you can subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, Overcast, anywhere you like to get your podcasts. You can follow us on Twitter at Folktale Project. You can find us on Auto Radio, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, Spotify, anywhere you like to listen. And you can always head over to folktaleproject.com, where you'll find a new story waiting for you every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Don't forget that if you'd like to help support the podcast, you can always head over to patreon.com/folktaleproject, where for as little as $1 a month, you can get early access to every story told. As always, thank you so much for listening.